Now the most multidisciplinary of all papers on this list, Caste, Courts and Business, Tanika Chakraborty. Thank you. And for this you have 16 minutes because
So I'll just skip the thanks and everything to Susan and start right away. I think Brian earlier raised an interesting question about why is the Indian judiciary so slow. I won't ask that. As an Indian, I take that as given and start from there in this particular paper. So I am sorry that I had to change the title of the paper a bit from what you mentioned as interdisciplinary. It's more of an economics paper actually. So we realized that.
What a shame.
Sorry?
What a shame.
We'll keep the flavor, don't worry. So essentially what we are going to talk about is formal contract enforcement, so delays in the Indian judiciary and what does it mean for entrepreneurial success. So typically in economic theory, we consider business to be a set of contracts. So we start from there. So essentially, what that means is that efficiency of the institution of contract enforcement has very important implications for the growth and prosperity of business. So there are in institutional economics very seminal papers and research which discusses the importance of contract enforcement, and other forms of institutions like property rights, etc., and their implications for business. What is interesting is that this cross-country macro studies that typically find a lot of significant effect of the property right institutions, but not so much of the contract enforcement institutions. Now, one of the reasons that we believe that this could be the case is possibly that when you look at developing countries, and most of these studies are based out of developing countries, cross-country developing country studies, one of the reasons could be that when you look at contract enforcement in the context of India, for instance, many of the contracts are informal. So informally enforced for most of the micro, small and medium businesses, they do not even approach the courts. So our question is that, so what we ask in this paper is, we ask whether judicial efficiency at all matters for the development of micro, small and medium enterprises. The question is not trivial to this in the sense that if everyone is avoiding the courts, then why is it important even? The formal judiciary. So what we think is that it's not about whether in equilibrium a person actually goes to the court, but rather whether there is the threat of courts or the opportunity lies there or not, the shadow of courts that what we talk about in economics, the shadow that would matter for a business or for contract enforcement, and that in turn would affect people's decision to start a business or not, or to write, in other words, write a contract or not. So in order to do this, so the most important part of this project, this was actually funded, part of a bigger project funded by RDIC Canada, where we have to build the data just like you did, on pendency, on delays in the Indian court system. So the data that exists is very macro again in nature. It's state level data, and only for the very recent years when the court started digitizing and record keeping. It doesn't exist in a centralized form in any database for the last several years. So a very important part of our project is to collect and create the Indian judicial data at the district level, a panel data, so for the last 10 or 15 years wherever available. So that's the most important question that we ask, and then we also ask one more question, which is whether the existence of this formal judicial system, is it more important, more important for certain sections of the society, which is more disadvantaged sections of the society, and we'll come to why and what, if I have time. I think I'll skip over the existing literature in the interest of time, but I'll just briefly mention that whatever exists in the context of India or within country study, again is very macro in nature simply because of the absence of data. So whatever studies exist is at best a cross state comparison, and I'll keep that in mind. So, and what we contribute here is primarily an econometric technique which uses the panel data and a new measure of court efficiency that we'll talk about. So, so far when we approached, so we had to approach as part of the data collection process every high court in India to get, so we asked for data since 2000, which was already very challenging, and we had various types of experiences across all the high courts of India in getting the data, and the data that we were looking for is really again not very disaggregated. All we were looking for is aggregate data in terms of pendency, disposal, and some age breakup in terms of cases. Something which is also published by the Supreme Court in its annual report at the national level. So we were hoping that we would be able to get this data at the district level, because that's what they use to do the national aggregates. And this is what we find. For some of the states, we find the longer time series, but there are many states which only give us 3-4 years of data, making it completely useless in the end in our analysis. So one of the measures that we use is the one that is very standard in the literature, which is basically the duration or the congestion rate. How long will it take for all the cases that is currently pending in the court to get solved if there were no new cases and if all cases were solved at the same rate. Okay. So this is a brief depiction of the data that we have and variation across states. So what you see over here is a drop line. So the negative, so all these drop lines which are going in the downward direction indicate inefficiencies. So longer delays, longer duration to solve cases, and all the positive ones are actually relatively efficient, so relative to the national average. So what it's showing you over here, for instance, West Bengal over all the years between 2000 and 2013 have always been negative compared to the national average, and over here if you look at Andhra Pradesh, it has always been positive compared to the national average. Okay? So, so one of the assumptions in the duration index, of course, is that there are no more new cases, and the other assumption there is that all cases, old and new, are solved at the same pace. So some sort of a first in, first out principle. Now what we believe is that when a person is deciding to run or start a business, what he or she cares about is possibly stories that they hear from their network about their cases getting solved, etc. So what matters more for him is whether a new case has been solved faster than a case which is 50-year-old or a 10-year-old case. So so what we find is there is a big variation in the fraction of cases which are new that is solved across the different districts or across India, for instance. So what we would do is we would use that as a new index and show you some of the results. And this is very interesting. This is basically showing you that if in any particular state, the state actually solves proportionately more old cases. So what you're taking is you're taking two states, they have the same pendency, same duration in terms of total number of cases, but just that one state is solving more of the newer cases than the other state. Okay? And what you find is that filing in those states are higher where the newer cases solved is higher. Okay? So more people file when the court is solving newer cases. So what we do is we combine that data with industrial data from 2006 and 7 that we find, the micro, small and medium enterprises. It's a census that is done in India, and the business indicators that we take that we could only find in this data is delay in registration. Okay, so that's one of the most important. So, if an enterprise starts in a particular year, starts its operation, when does it get registered under Companies Act? Okay. So, so one of the things that this panel data actually allows us to do is it allows us to control for what we call the district fixed effect. So, basically it is like saying that what we are testing here is whether a more efficient judiciary. So, there are various definitions of efficient judiciary and we are using two once again just to remind you. One is the overall delay, which is the duration of the congestion rate, and the other one is what is the proportion of cases that is being solved are new as opposed to being old, right. And what the problem that we would face typically when answering this question is that a state which has a better judiciary might also have better governance in many other ways. So, that's where the panel data at the district level actually comes in, because we can look at districts within a state. Typically governance related decisions are taken at the state level. So, within a state we are looking at two districts, one where the proportion of new cases being solved is higher than the other district. So, keeping everything else constant between these two districts, whether a more efficient judiciary has an impact on opening up or registration of businesses. So, what we find is that firms are 10% more likely to experience a delay in registration if the average duration to solve civil cases goes up by a year. Okay, so, this is the overall duration in terms of overall cases that you have. But compare that with our new measure of the fraction of new cases that is being solved. In fact, when we look at this new measure, what we find is that the delay in registration is much higher when we use this measure of inefficiency of the courts, which is talking about what is the fraction of new cases that a court solves, right. And so, this is the main finding. That apart, we also find that this is not just about registration, this is also about the growth of firms in terms of the employment that the firm has. So, for instance, firms are more likely to grow and have a higher employment in districts that have a more efficient court. And another interesting finding was that we find that the efficiency of this formal judiciary is particularly important for female entrepreneurs and for entrepreneurs coming from disadvantaged groups, the social SC/ST categories in India. One of the reasons that we think this is possible is that when you look at groups which are less represented in the entrepreneurial world, they have less of a chance to go back to their networks and get the help of the network. So, they rely more on the formal institutions to get their businesses to grow and to start. Okay, so, so just to sum up, what we do is we first collect the Indian judiciary data in terms of the pendency and disposal at district level for the last 10 to 15 years, whichever state has finally given us data. We merge that with the industrial data to see if more efficient judiciary has has an impact on the growth and the starting up of businesses. What we do find is that yes, a more efficient formal judiciary actually helps in the growth of businesses and helps more so, and this benefit is more so for socially disadvantaged groups. And most interestingly, the idea is that we do care about the environment of businesses in India. So, we want to make it more business friendly. The question is, when we talk about judiciary, there is a lot of discussion about vacancy in judiciary and the infrastructure and so on, whether that is useful to make judiciary more efficient. So, suppose I assume that there is a capacity constraint in the judiciary and this is a very long term process of improving it. So, what we are suggesting here is that what our findings suggest here is that if you take the current capacity constraint and if you are willing to have just a little bit modification in terms of how much weight you put on the new cases as opposed to the old cases. So, putting just a little bit higher weight on solving the new cases possibly might help in improving the situation for contract enforcement and helping businesses to grow and to start. Okay? So right now, our findings are really based on a subset of states from where we got the data. We are still trying to actually convince all the courts, all the high courts of India to give us the data, this district level data of pendency and disposal for the last 10-15 years. We hope at some point we would be able to do this for entire India. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Shubho, 10 minutes.
So the relationship between better institutions and functioning of functioning courts with economic outcomes is coming into play in India only recently. And I think for many years, even in economics, economists considered capital and labor to be the more important determinants of economic success, and institutions were not that well studied. As the Ease of Doing Business report did, I think it has finally moved the importance of getting institutions and studying institutions and explaining why the differences in the institutions create this level of differences in economic outcomes or well-being between different groups of people. I think the paper has a very important role in establishing some of these questions, in convincing people that these things matter more than probably direct interventions, for example, MSME loans or giving direct assistance to financial firms. However, some of the things that I find problematic is the relationship. First, when a person, if you are measuring between the distance between a person deciding to register a firm and then start operations, that distance may not be determined by the efficiency of courts, because you have decided to register the firm, and after that the delay is mostly due to getting financing, getting your things up and running. The second thing is, I think there are some district fixed effects we must consider, which is because of the fact that local courts are funded by local governments, and local governments, state governments in India might vary the level of resources given to each district. This is a very common thing which we might find, for example, what we consider as the chief minister's constituency or the law minister's constituency. Whenever there is a powerful person who is directly in the cabinet from that constituency, those constituencies generally are seen to receive more resources. So what we might be seeing in this data is actually some third effect, which is affecting both the functioning of courts and the functioning of setting up of MSMEs. Maybe the district got a minister from that district, and he's not only filled up the vacancies in the judiciary, but also filled up the vacancies in the local state MSME lending corporation or the district cooperative bank, which led to more disbursal. So I think a large number of other effects really need to be culled out and seen to see that whether this is only due to the delay in judiciary. General improvement in governance also is reflected in improvement in judiciary. And this might get reflected in this system. But that, I think, enforces the requirement of better institutions, not only in judiciary, but other features. While it is important to think that, yes, people from disadvantaged or marginalized groups may not have the social networks to set up businesses, but we must understand that accessing judiciary in India is also not so easy. If you are from a marginalized group, if you are capital constrained, or if you are constrained from social networks, accessing courts are also much more difficult. We don't see this, at least what I have seen in the filings in the Supreme Court or the High Court or other courts. It is not as if the marginalized groups of India are litigating more. They do not turn up in the names of litigants. So expecting them to see the formal court process improving and therefore hoping that they would use that is something which probably we need to establish more before we start identifying that causation. But even given that, when the water rises, all boats rise up. And when improvement in governance happens, probably marginalized groups rise up along with other entities. So that area I'm still a little confused about and not fully convinced about. Thank you.
Great. We have a few minutes for questions. Anybody? Oh my gosh. we can make up some time. And I'll just make a comment that the challenge with this kind of research is methodological. So the because of the tools that you're using are such that you have to. It's a very high bar to convince the statistician that you have control for everything to draw the conclusions that you are. Conclusions you're drawing are intuitively very plausible, but there might be some methodological issues that you run into, but that's for your academic peers to figure out. My 2 cents on this is that this kind of research could be greatly enriched with other methodological approaches trying to address the same question. So if you do a combination of rigorous empirical work with all its constraints thanks to data and all of that, lack of availability of data and so on, but also do, quote unquote, not for the economists, but for the economists this is softer research, but interviews or whatever, ethnographic studies, case studies, it adds to a body of knowledge and a narrative that becomes, could be mutually reinforcing and very compelling. Thank you. You got any other, you want to add anything? Anybody?
I just want to ask, it's not possible to, I mean, I know the challenges in data are just, it's just immense, but one of the big questions is that not all cases in district courts are contract enforcement cases. There may be a variety of other types of cases, and the problem of which types of cases are sort of dominate in a district court would matter, right? And
maybe I'll take the questions in a reverse order. So starting with yours first. Yes, they do matter. And so what we have here is civil cases only. And when we checked, civil cases are primarily burdened with land disputes. So the hypothesis here is that, of course, we cannot go into the details of business disputes or land disputes, etc. So what we are saying here is that if there's a delay in the court process, that deters business formation. Right? So even if land disputes are congesting the court, that would lead to an eventual delay. So that's the whole point of the civil cases that we have. So going back to the methodology, which I think both of your questions are related to some extent, what you were raising about local governance, yes, so that is one of the most important challenges of this sort of questions in economics when you're trying to draw some kind of causal story, and that is the whole reason why we want to go from state level aggregate data to district level, because then it allows you at least to address the state level common problems across all the districts that we do handle with panel data methods that I did not go into details in the interest of time, but we do have panel data methods which essentially take care of the fact that two districts are different in multiple ways. So we have the district fixed effects, which essentially means that you're comparing two districts which are similar in nature in multiple ways, and you're also looking within a district over time. What that does is that takes care of all the governance issues that state A might have which are different from state B, and what district A within state A might have which are different from district B in state A. So two districts within the same state. What it doesn't take care of is what Shubha was raising earlier, that it is possible that at a specific point of time a district gets a certain person in judiciary who is possibly more efficient, also gets a certain person in governance, in bureaucracy, who is also more efficient. And so what we have is this, in statistics we call it the district time effects. Of course, we cannot account for that. What we do account for in this paper is to be able to handle any difference in growth rates across the districts. We might not have any specific event that is happening in district in a particular year, let's say 2009, but we are able to handle any growth rate difference between two districts between the time 2000 and 2009. So the 2000 and 2015 that we have in the data. So that's one. And the other question that you raised about registration is not possibly an important variable to look at. Well, part of it is that we are restricted by the availability of data, but at the same time, I think that so firms decide to register. As soon as they decide to register or they do register, they come under the gambit of formal laws, much more than they don't register, right? So it is a decision on part of the firm whether to come under formal laws, and that does depend on the efficiency of the formal court system. So to that extent, even a delay in registration or whether you do register at some point of time is an important variable in economics to look at.
Just to, help your effort to get more data, you should be plugged into the Niti Aayog. They're trying to develop a district-wise database. So, it'll be great if somehow you can exchange information.
I mean, if, we did talk to them, but it would be